All right. Jonathan, we're live. We're ready?
Ready to go.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the ABM agency webinar around demand gen, lead gen, and ABM, and what's the difference. In today's environment, marketers are faced with all kinds of challenges, and they're looking to drive and impact the business, drive value, impact business, increase the forecast downstream, et cetera. And they use a lot of different tactics and campaigns. And today, just want to kind of level set on the differences and kind of ABM and where that fits in. So with that, let's jump in and introduce the team. My name is Jason Sanders. I'll be your moderator today. With me is a great team from the ABM agency. We have Jason McDaniel, who is their director of strategy, Jonathan Ward, who is the director of RevOps, and Rob Elbaz, who is director of advertising operations. So they bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. And so we want to lay the foundation and see what they have to say relative to ABM, demand gen, and lead gen. So with that, want to ask, start by asking a question. When we look at demand gen and lead gen, are there differences? And if so, what's the difference between demand gen and lead gen?
That's a good question, Jason. I can start with just a general baseline in terms of the two tactics. So demand gen it's all about generating awareness at the top of the funnel, which later influences bottom of funnel activity, which could include leads. It could include just lower level touches from an account perspective. But really, it's about that top of level awareness generation, and then the process of moving that strategically from a nurture perspective down funnel. Whereas lead gen, it focuses primarily around those low level activities. So generating the most leads for the cheapest cost. A lot of times those leads can be relatively out of market. It could be people, downloading content, which it's not easily workable. They even could be leads that are, they fall outside of ICP parameters. So that's really, baseline high level. Jonathan, do you want to jump in, talk some specifics there?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess what really makes this a relevant question today, and also what causes a lot of confusion in my mind, is that sometimes demand gen and lead gen are talked about as a strategy, and sometimes they're talked about as tactics. The way I like to look at it is demand gen is very much more of a strategy designed to generate demand by educating your potential customers, providing value so that when they're ready to buy or ready to engage with you, you'll be top of mind and they can come organically. Whereas lead gen to me is much more of a tactic to actually capture that demand. And you hear that a lot these days, especially on LinkedIn, the difference between creating demand and capturing demand. As marketers, we like to, come up with new phrases for the same thing. And in my mind, that's very much what demand gen and lead gen are. So in my mind, you can't really have one without the other. You can create demand all day, but if you don't have a mechanism to capture it, you're not going to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's very challenging to be successful without doing some form of lead gen. Popular to say lead generation is dying, lead generation is losing out to demand generation. And I think it's fair. There's that higher focus now on demand generation and actually building up your market, making sure there's a demand for your product, making sure that you're a thought leader in this space, that you're seen as, the gold standard for solving the product or the need that you're generating demand for. So, while this is very trendy, you still need something to capture those leads on the other side. You still need something that's going to turn somebody who is aware of the problem, is interested in your solution, into someone workable, someone that you could speak to, somebody that you could close a deal with.
Absolutely. You all are based in Atlanta, Georgia, and you work with a myriad of sized organizations, from startups to large enterprise. Given your experience and the types of engagements you've seen across the board, what do you think is driving this shift from lead gen to demand gen in the velocity you see today?
Great question. Well, I mean, if you spend any time on LinkedIn, you will see this all over the place. This is just like a quick search for lead gen, and you'll see lead gen's dead, the MQL's dead. A lot of talk about things like the dark funnel and how we should move away from measuring those top of funnel tactics and things like that. I think there's a lot of validity in those, some of those statements, but at the end of the day, there's nuance to this. I think what's really driving that is that, a lot of like the traditional tactics used in some of these strategies are focused on the wrong thing and optimizing for the wrong thing. So when we are talking about lead gen, optimizing for lead volumes is not necessarily going to be an effective strategy. Whereas, optimizing for some of those business objectives that really drive true ROI and revenue, that's sort of where the trend is moving, and demand gen facilitates that. There are some trade-offs though with demand gen. It does take a little bit longer. It's a little bit of an organic inbound flow of interest. So you have to be able to build up that credibility. And whereas lead gen, if you need this to pull in some of that demand real quickly, you can focus on those tactics as well. Jason,
yeah, I just want to double click on what Jonathan is saying in terms of what we're seeing on social. It's all so hyperbolic. The idea of generating leads is never going to be dead as a concept, because leads ultimately are able to drive revenue, able to drive pipeline. But I think that when we as marketers think about lead generation, a lot of organizations are doing it badly, and there's a difference between good and bad lead gen. And bad lead gen, I think, is absolutely dead, because it's focusing on strategies and tactics that are, they're generating leads for the sake of generating leads. It's a quantity versus quality value prop. They have KPIs that they need to meet that are entirely lead gen focused. So marketers get desperate. They turn to channels and tactics that are going to be driving poor leads knowingly. And this is, it's activity for activity's sake, but it's not going to, from a bottom line perspective, generate revenue, which is what we need to do, and why people on social media are talking so adamantly about demand gen, because it's really focused top of funnel. It's really about driving quality. It's really about getting people to actually engage and to have conversations with sales, which is the end goal there.
Yeah, it sounds very similar to the movie Glenn Ross type leads, bad lead gen. So and the sales folks know all about that, right? So when you think about what we're talking here, shifting strategy more towards demand gen, still having a sound lead gen strategy, where does ABM fit into all of this?
I love that you just kind of segued into, sales teams and how sales teams fit into the conversation, because, this is giving your sales teams what they want. This is going after the types of accounts that have been identified as strong fits. So ABM can be layered into both demand gen and lead generation strategies or tactics. It matters, when you're talking about push advertising, when you're on display networks, when you're running putting ads in front of people, it's a question of who you're targeting. So targeting people from the types of companies that you want to be getting in front of, targeting the right personas. But also when you're talking about demand gen, it's thinking about exactly who are you talking to and what type of bait do you need to line your hook with to make sure you're attracting them to your site. So in that sense, when we're talking about ABM, we're talking, of course, about going after specific accounts, building out, ideal customer profiles to make sure we understand who we want to reach, and then reaching them specifically. So there's, less lead gen to be done because you already know which companies you're going after, and there's some tools that could help you fill in the blanks as long as you're just talking to a few people within those companies. Right. And then again, on the demand gen side, when you're bringing people in, it's making sure you're leveraging those tools to understand who's coming to your site, measuring them, and understand, where they are in your funnel, how far along they've gone in their customer journey.
And demand gen is really, it really works very synergistically with ABM, because you're approaching it from a top of funnel mentality with demand gen, where the goal is to generate awareness amongst accounts. ABM, there's a handshake process that can take place where we see the accounts that are engaging with those demand gen programs through our various tools that we have available as marketers, our intent datas of the world, our visitor intelligence, our marketing nurture, our automation flows, and we can piggyback off a lot of those signals to help us develop more streamlined, better lists. Because at the end of the day, from a marketing perspective, it's all gonna come down to the audience that we're targeting, and demand gen is really great for shining a light on the accounts that we feel like are priority for the ABM program.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're probably targeting the ICP, maybe flushing out additional accounts that maybe aren't on the target account list, et cetera. So it's, makes sense. How does ABM fit into your overall strategy relative to demand gen then?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously there's the benefits that we just talked about, but I think the important thing, or one of the main questions you might want to ask is do you have like a strong framework for demand gen in place? I think if you do have that, it's a great opportunity to begin adding in ABM into your tactics. But I think, you do have to have the fundamentals in place to be able to execute that effectively. ABM is a pretty heavy lift. So making sure that you have things like your standard lead routing set up, a clear definition of who your ICP is and things like that will really help ensure that you're setting yourself up for success with ABM specifically. And then, making sure you have like the team and infrastructure in place as well. So, creating that personalized content for one-to-one account outreach is super critical. Do you have a team that can support that, and the infrastructure to really market out, and with the technology and whatnot needed to really target those accounts at a one-to-one basis?
Let me just follow up real quickly on that. A lot of times I'm sure you run into an organization that may not have the team in place or the capacity or the experience for tech stack, et cetera. Is that an area that you can still assist, and those organizations can still run an ABM campaign, or is that something that they need to build for?
So I think, it depends, I would say, to some degree. I think there are definitely things that you can do without the technology and whatnot in place. It depends on the type of ABM campaign you want to run as well. But you can take steps in the right direction for sure, and then build your way out there as well. I don't know, Rob or Jason, if you have any other thoughts there.
Absolutely. And I think even the next slide kind of addresses this, Jason, when you're thinking about what makes sense as how costly it can become to run ABM, and whether or not you could find ways to lower those costs by working with an agency so that you could piggyback off of some of their cost savings that they have built into it. You really want to look at, what's the payoff at the end of the day. So this chart kind of shows that if the types of companies that you're going after maybe have smaller revenue, lower buying cycles, it's just the owner or just the main decision maker who's getting involved, the contract sizes aren't very large, you don't necessarily need to be making that ABM push. Demand gen comes in here, but mostly you're thinking about getting that volume of leads where that volume exists. You're going after a lot of small businesses. You don't need to necessarily invest as much into any single account. When you're getting higher up into these companies with multiple members in the buying committee, with influencers, you need to give people content so that when they're having these discussions internally, they're bringing up your material. They're saying, have you seen this fantastic webinar that discussed the difference between demand gen, lead gen, and ABM? This is something that we should be thinking about. This is something that should be coming into our decision-making conversation, and here are the thought leaders that brought this to us. And then when you're looking at very large companies, enterprise levels, large contracts, buying committees that could be multiple members laid out over multiple geographies even, this is where ABM gets really attractive, because the difference between winning and losing a deal could be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. and even the difference between getting the most out of a deal and making sure you're finding the exact right, product fit or services mix fit to bring to that client can be a very hefty question as well. So you want to make sure that you've checked everything, you've dotted your I's, you've crossed your T's, and you're bringing them a really personalized, really unique experience that's going to seal the deal and win that contract.
So, looking at this and orienting myself, and others are probably doing the same thing, obviously when you get to the enterprise, you are dealing with very structured procurement processes and a much larger buying committee. When you start moving left, closer towards demand gen, how do you decide what type of ABM campaign to run as you approach ABM or those longer, more complex sales cycles? Is there a way?
Yeah, I mean, and that's really the crux of it all, Jason. You really at the beginning of the program and what you decide to launch, you need to determine what your priorities are from a business perspective. Does your target audience know you in the market? What type of accounts are you trying to target from a firmographic perspective, from a revenue band perspective? What's the maturity level of your current program? Are you starting it from the ground up? Is it something that's been running for some substantial amount of time? What are your capabilities in creating the personalized content that Jonathan spoke to earlier? Do you have a team in place that can fully satisfy those one-to-few, one-to-one type campaigns that we like to talk about? All of that is something that the lift needs to be done in the beginning in order to determine what sort of campaign is best for you, because we see a lot of organizations fall on their face when they don't actually account for all these different nuances. Rob, what are your thoughts there?
I think in terms of one-to-many, that's exactly it. You want to be, building that demand. You want to be talking to the right people, and then as you start with your foundation, you narrow in where are the biggest opportunities that you could group together. So this is where those one-to-few campaigns come in, where you're thinking of a handful of accounts. It could be 10 accounts, it could be up to 100 accounts, even potentially more than that, depending on the size. But there should be something that links them together, some common messaging, common theme that you're going to be using to make sure that these accounts know you're speaking to their specific pain points. And then as you get to that one-to-one level, you have to make that decision. Is it worth it to go after this account with a very targeted push, and what types of collateral can you bring out for them? Because when you're getting to one-to-one now, you need to impress them. Sure, it's one thing to show that you could reach them, but are you reaching them with the right message, the right product, the right packaging that's going to let them know you mean business, you're a serious company to get into bed with? So when it comes down to one-to-one, you have to really make sure everything is there in place to show that you're talking specifically to this account. The value is there, the fit is there. You've done the work to determine for them that you're a great product to meet their needs and help them be more profitable. And it's just about convincing them of that.
No, that's great. I want to, before we move into, what success would look like in these campaigns, as you get down into the one-to-one, it's really around orchestration through a lot of channels, et cetera. But the orchestration that's really critical, I think, that maybe you all have a different perspective or a unique approach to is the sales aspect of it, the sales side. If you just touch on it briefly as to what consideration you give to sales enablement or the sales handoff, I think that'd be something impactful to highlight.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the top of the head. It's especially somewhat with one-to-few, but even more so with one-to-one campaigns. I think they really lend themselves to a high level of sales involvement. A lot of times you're talking about, targeting large accounts where retention and expansion is a big part of that. Making sure you have that alignment with sales, I think, is super critical. So communicating what you're doing on the marketing side and what's been effective there will really help, you know, the sales team understand what sort of messaging to use, what sort of content's out there that's resonating with those accounts, and really, you know, kicking off those conversations that will lead to a higher level success.
I think
Right.
following from that, making sure you're doing the right things in terms of marketing automations and monitoring to make sure sales and marketing aren't stepping on each other's toes. So when sales makes that contact, when that deal has matured or when that account has matured, is marketing keeping pace? Has the message changed appropriately? Has it stopped if it needs to stop? So making sure sales and marketing are working in lockstep is a huge part of the success of ABM.
Yeah, I agree. As you move to the enterprise, teams are going to be well oiled and well structured on those target accounts, and they're going to have account plans for expansion, et cetera. So I think this is a great bolt on, as you mentioned earlier, Jason McDaniel, to even the sales activities. So I kind of want to pivot and just, with a little bit of time left, talk about what success looks like with the different types of campaigns. And then maybe some of the reasons that they're not successful. But let's start with the success metrics.
Absolutely. So we'll start with lead generation, and we spoke about it before. Lead generation typically was very focused on getting a high volume of leads. I think now it's become even more important to make sure those leads are quality. Nobody is just looking at phone numbers and email addresses anymore at the back end. If you're not generating MQLs, if they're not turning into sales qualified leads, if they're not turning into opportunities and closed deals, you're not going to be considered a successful lead gen campaign manager. So it's all about generating, I would say, qualified leads at this stage. And then, at what cost are you doing it? At what rates are those leads then turning into opportunities and even closed deals? And what's the ROI on the campaign? When you move to demand generation, it gets a little bit stickier because this is a process that can take months, even years for, someone to turn from an interested viewer into a client. So here you're looking at engagement metrics. Is the website getting more traffic? Are the blog posts getting more views? Is the content performing? And then using the measurement tools to make sure it's performing within the right audience. So yes, you're putting a blog post up. Is it reaching your ICP? Is it reaching your target account list? Is it reaching the right personas within there? And making sure you have the tools set up to measure that as well. And then on the ABM side, success becomes almost fairly cut and dry because you have your target accounts. So you're looking at how many of those accounts are you reaching? How are they moving through the funnel? How many of them are turning into closed deals? And for the ones that are already clients, how many of those contracts are growing and being retained as you go? What's nice about the ABM portion of this is if you're setting your target account list properly, measuring success just becomes a question of measuring how the account health of each of these accounts within that target list are doing.
Yeah, that's very thorough, Rob. I guess the only thing I would really add is that with demand gen and even more so ABM, the metrics and KPIs are really more skewed towards business objectives and revenue. So, we talked earlier on about why people are moving away from lead gen, and it's because they're really being optimized for those top of funnel activities. That still happens to a degree with demand gen, and it's hard to get companies sort of out of that framework of like what you can measure and whatnot. But when you look at some of these things listed here under ABM specifically, like average contract value, lifetime value, sales cycle length, those are all things that are really built around a well-performing business and driving revenue.
Oh, that's great. It makes sense. Again, here comes the sales aspects, business value. All sounds in line and outstanding. What are some of the reasons that organizations aren't successful in deploying an ABM campaign?
So I think one of the things that one of the reasons companies might fail at ABM is that, it's become very buzzworthy. It's become something that every B2B marketer is being told that they should be getting involved in. So they know they want to get into ABM, but they don't necessarily understand what they want to get out of ABM. They haven't done the planning that's necessary. They haven't built out a target account list that makes sense in terms of size, in terms of customer fit. Maybe they haven't listed out what their ideal customer profile is yet. And then going from there, it takes work the whole way through, deciding who your personas are, who is an influencer, who is on the buying committee, who might be a budget owner that needs to be convinced as well, what messages need to be crafted for each of those personas, and then what the channel mix is to best deploy those messages. So if you're not planning every step of the way, if you're not checking all those boxes, if you're missing steps, then unfortunately you're setting yourself up for failure in ABM. I think you're on mute, Jason.
I think Jason's got caught.
Sorry, guys. Yes, I agree with all that, Rob. The only thing that I would add in terms of companies failing is a lot of times these organizations they're not setting themselves up for success. They're not measuring the right touch points. They're approaching it from a traditional lead gen KPI, and they have knee-jerk reactions based off the program when they don't see immediate leads come in through it. So for basically those reasons, we need to reframe what the ABM program is, especially to leadership, because a lot of times if you don't set that expectation in the beginning, 3 months go by, you haven't generated the MQLs, the leads that they're used to, and they're confused and they want to shut off the program. So it's super critical from the very beginning just to set expectations properly with leadership.
Yeah, that's going to be critical, right? Because what I've heard throughout is this is a long play, long-term nurture, right? At critical accounts with the proper people that would be a part of that buying committee. If I think about it, aligning our efforts towards companies that have the highest probability to do business with us makes sense, right? But agree that a lot of folks tend to probably fall into traditional KPIs, which can derail the true value. So we want to separate the signal from the noise. And I think what I've heard today from all of you is that ABM campaigns are a good way to do that. Isolate the accounts and the personas and separate the signal from the noise. So with that, I think we're coming up on time here. If you want to get in touch with the ABM agency, they're at abmagency.com. You can follow them on LinkedIn as well. But great job today. Thanks for sharing your insights with us across the board. This is just the first of many, I'm told, and this was just an entry-level 101. So really appreciate it. Thank you, Rob, Jason, and Jonathan for your insights today. And thanks for everybody who joined us on LinkedIn Live. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.